I'm Sam Wilhoit, this is Henry Ponce, Evan Youd, and Ryan Zabib, and we are presenting on fossil fuel dependency. Carbon emissions have been quickly rising, and humans haven't been able to effectively slow it down. According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, since 1970, CO2 emissions have increased by about 90%, with emissions from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes contributing to about 78% of the total greenhouse gas emission increase from 1970 to 2011. Carbon emissions also pose a great threat to human and environmental health. According to the World Health Organization, 4.2 million people die every year as a result of ambient air pollution, and it is the poorest who are affected most by this. According to the UN Environment Program, in the big cities of developing countries, it's the poorest who live in cramped, informal settlements who feel the full force of air pollution. As you can see on this graph to my left, carbon emissions have increased greatly over the last 100 years.
The problem we are obviously facing is fossil fuels, but more specifically, what can be done about humanity's dependence on fossil fuels? According to the Environmental Protection Agency, a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy resources is ideal due to the significant reduction in carbon emissions between the two and thus lower environmental impact. However, this transition is not currently feasible. First of all, Soteris Kaligaro, professor of engineering and technology, explains that not only are fossil fuels cheaper than renewables, but they are also much more energy efficient. Next, Bloomberg New Energy Finance explains that fossil fuels receive $557 billion in government subsidies in just 1 year, whereas renewables received a mere $43 billion, which pales in comparison. The resulting effect was that these renewables were unable to effectively compete against fossil fuels in the competitive marketplace, as can be seen in this graph here provided by Brookings, in which the yellow figures make up the fossil fuels, which are clearly dominating the industry. Next slide, please. Additionally, Barry Rabe, a professor of environmental policy, analyzes the politics of fossil fuels and concludes that politicians, specifically Republicans, receive substantial campaign funding from fossil fuel businesses, and as a result, direct government funds to these fossil fuel organizations, and resist calls to combat a major cause of pollution at its roots in the fossil fuel industry. At an international level, Aaron Sain of the National Governance Institute remarks that with governments in which elites share natural resource money, believing that this money is crucial to their country's survival, the superiority of fossil fuels goes unchallenged. Finally, Eimer Zeman of Waterloo University states that a different form of political organization beginning at the level of the planetary is what is currently needed for a renewable transition. Thus, we must change the way in which we use fossil fuels now in order to pave a path to renewable energy resources.
Now, one way we can bridge the gap between fossil fuels and renewables is through carbon sequestration. What carbon sequestration basically is capturing carbon in the air and placing it somewhere else. Two major techniques are biological sequestration and geological sequestration. As the name implies, biological sequestration involves force sequestering carbon by capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turning it into biomass through photosynthesis, according to the United Nations Commission for Europe. This means by simply planting more trees around the Earth, we can reduce the amount of carbon in the air. Another way is geological carbon sequestration, and this works vastly differently, as it involves compressing the carbon in the air into some type of liquid. This liquid can be recycled to create tertiary recovery, which is basically injecting CO2 liquid into oil-bearing formations in order to reduce the viscosity of oil, according to the United States Geological Survey. If it's not used to reduce the oil viscosity, then it can simply be put back into the ground into geological basins nearby the factories. As of 2013, this strategy is very viable, as 3,000 metric gigatons of extra storage are available underground. And according to the MIT Climate Portal, they also state that this has a 90% efficiency rate, which means that 90% of the carbon is taken out of the air affected by the geological sequestration. However, this comes with its flaws. For biological sequestration, the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin states that power plants emit air pollutants and water vapor, as fog in the atmosphere could affect the growth and survival of certain vegetation communities. This means that it can create an unfair environment that is vastly different from the original factory's intents. On top of that, geological sequestration is very expensive, costing $500 to $800 per ton of carbon, according to the Clear Center of UC Davis. And this cost is from the direct air capture, which is directly sucking out carbon and condensing it into a liquid. On top of that, it can cost $100 to $1,000. It can cost 100 to 1,000 years to fully dissipate into the ground, according to Chin Zhang, a geochemist with a PhD at the University of California.
Another viable solution to curb carbon emissions without abolishing fossil fuels is through the implementation of carbon taxes. According to Brad Plumer, a climate reporter specializing in policy and technology efforts to cut carbon dioxide for the New York Times, more than 40 governments worldwide have now adopted some sort of price on carbon. For example, coal use plummeted after the introduction of a carbon tax in Britain in 2013. Additionally, Zhao Lui, a professor and PhD holder of economics from the University of Hong Kong, advocates for the solution as well. He writes, "It is evident that carbon tax is an effective economic instrument to achieve carbon emission abatement." Next slide, please. One of the limitations to this plan is that carbon taxes, like any controversial bill, will be very difficult to pass. According to Barry G. Rabe, a professor of environmental policy at the School of Natural Resources and Environment, this is because carbon pricing presumes that politicians are willing and able to make the case for a sustained increase in the price of commodities that are familiar and essential in everyday life. It further assumes that the public are willing to rally to the cause. Next slide, please. Another implication is that carbon taxes are regressive, meaning that it unfairly burdens the lower class. This results in lower class individuals having to pay a larger percentage of their income when compared to higher income households. Julius Anderson, a researcher at the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics, analyzed a study done that examined the change in different income groups after the introduction of carbon taxes in Sweden. He writes, "The overall trend is towards an increase as time goes on in the burden borne by lower income groups, i.e. in regressivity, which is highly correlated with the increase in income inequality that has occurred in Sweden in the recent years." Next slide, please.
Carbon taxes are the better solution when compared to carbon sequestration. A fast-acting plan is necessary if we are to make the proper shift to renewables in the future. Carbon taxes have already worked before, and when compared to sequestration, can be implemented relatively quickly. Carbon sequestration, however, is very effective since it is able to remove upwards of 90% of the carbon in a given area. But carbon sequestration takes a long time, and if it fails, carbon could just leak back into the atmosphere. Carbon taxes are not without their problems, however. It unfairly burdens the lower class, and the legislation can be messy, and the bills can take a long time to pass. Sanjay Patnaik, who holds a master's in economics and in computer science, states that carbon pricing is the most basic and effective tool to reduce carbon emissions. Using carbon taxes now can help us to transition to a future without fossil fuels. Thank you.
Nice job, guys. Okay, I have a few questions for you. Again, for the purpose of questions, I'm going to name you guys student 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's who your names will be when I refer to you in combination. Okay, let's start with student 4. We'll mix it up here. So student 4, give one specific way that your thinking changed as a result of thinking about student 1's research. What did he contribute to the way you thought about your research?
So, Sam's paper examined humanity's addiction to fossil fuels while being aware of the environmental impacts posed by fossil fuels. And he did this by citing a statistic from the Journal of Energies that showed humanity's continued use of fossil fuels throughout the 20th century. Now, in my paper, I had the notion that the transition to fossil fuels would be so dire that it would be so widely accepted because all of humanity would understand the implications if a transition would not be taken. But because Sam found that humanity has been addicted to fossil fuels throughout history, while knowing the implications of fossil fuels, it made me rethink that the transition might not be as widely accepted as I first thought.
Okay, excellent. Okay, student 3, going backwards. What's an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' papers that you guys decided to exclude, so it like didn't make it into your final presentation? And you can choose anyone, including your own.
So one argument that we decided to exclude was Sam's argument about how humanity has been addicted to fossil fuels. According to Energies, like Ryan said, they increased by 67% from 1992 to 2017. We decided to exclude this information from our presentation specifically because we felt that subsidies had a much more substantial leg to stand on in an argument, because it went in an overall summary instead of a specific number that we can count on to describe our problem.
Terrific. Okay, student 2. In what way did your team's resolution make you think differently about your own research? So in terms of the choices you made at the end, how does that reflect back on your IRR?
So my IRR was mostly confined to looking at why we continue to use fossil fuels, and more specifically why a transition to renewables isn't too possible right now, which we outlined in the problem. What I learned from the resolution was that there are ways in which we can change our current methods of using fossil fuels that can actually pave a path to renewables. As our resolution stated, we chose carbon taxes, and what essentially would happen was through this implementation of carbon taxes, we can make renewables an actual reality. I was not completely aware of this through writing my IRR, as my IRR almost phrased it as if we can't transition to renewables, but through learning about our resolution, I learned that this is in fact possible. By implementing this, changes can occur. We can eventually get a future with renewable resources.
Terrific. And then finally, student number 1, if you guys could have a 5th team member, right, what additional lens do you think might have helped for your presentation to be more complete?
So I would say the lens that would help us the most would be the futuristic lens, because none of us wrote about that. Time is a very important factor in our solutions. With carbon taxes, how long they would take to implement, and with sequestration, how long it would take to occur exactly. And so this 5th perspective would look into the exact time frames for each of these solutions. As we stated, it is long, but we weren't able to include exactly how long. And they would also talk about how long it would take from using these solutions to fully switch to renewable energy.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Well done.